Great, thank you very much. Yeah, the pen fell to me to explain this. This work represents probably 12 versions of the portfolio manual over 18 months, and this is kind of where we got to. And then we decided that as a team, we really need to test this to go much further. So that's what I'm going to be taking you through. It is a beta document. I think the first thing about the portfolio manual is that it was developed to assess an identified need. So we were getting calls from people who were saying, okay, that's all fine and good, PIEVC, but how do I deal with 1,000 buildings? Those sorts of questions, and people were asking us for guidance. So the decision was taken to develop some guidance around those sorts of things. And the team that gathered to do this work all had experience in using PIEVC in various portfolio contexts without understanding at the time that that's what we were doing. So we had to draw all of that out. So, but the other thing that I thought was key to this is developed by practitioners for practitioners. So we're trying as much as possible not to be academic about this, but how to go about, how would you go about this? And in that regard, where we coined a new term, a new piece of jargon that would be used in the process, it was for specific practitioner needs. And we'll come to that in a few places where there were key reasons why we landed on some of that terminology. It draws heavily on other PIEVC processes, so it integrates vulnerability and risk analysis, but it does introduce a new concept around archetype analysis, which we will talk about in a few minutes. As I said earlier, it's ready for field testing. It has undergone extensive peer review, so the community that reviewed this believe it is as good as it can be at this point. But it is a living document and it needs to be tested. So much like PIEVC itself, we reached a point with the procedure where we need to go out and field test it to pull in the information to make the next set of iterations on it. So I envisage this to keep growing much the way PIEVC has grown over the years. We'll use it for a while, come back to it and say, okay, these are new innovations people have added in. These are things that are not being used very much and can fall by the wayside. So that sort of thinking. So let me take you through where it sits today very quickly. This is a relatively long presentation, so I'm going to skim quickly, but if there are questions, please feel free to raise them. I want to give the complete coverage of the manual, so this is a bit of a walkthrough of what this document looks like. So it starts with the same sort of concept as the catalog, with a roadmap of the way through the process. And there are two key tracks that you can follow as a practitioner. You can start from scratch, which would then take you down this path here. And that takes you through, much like the PIEVC protocol did, a bunch of principles. What's a portfolio, what's vulnerability, what's risk, what are those key sorts of definitional things that we need to understand to effectively execute the procedure. The other track just takes you straight down into the procedure. So if you have some experience in doing this sort of work, you would probably take the part one principles and put it to the side and only go back and refer to it on very rare occasion. If you were brand new to the process, you would probably want to read that first part and make sure we were all on the same page. So I'm going to start with going through the principles very quickly. So the principle section covers fundamentals. It gives the definitions of all of the terminology within the document, and it gives some background as to why the core approaches that are laid out in the procedures are the core process. So it gives some contextualization around what those procedures are and why they're being used. The first thing is, of course, to define portfolio, and believe it or not, this was a big piece of work. We all had different ideas of what that might be. Referring to Webster's didn't help. We really needed to get our head around what specifically is a portfolio if we are going to be designing a procedure for assessing a portfolio. So what does it mean? And after a significant amount of work on this, we decided that a portfolio is clearly it's a collection of assets characterized by different climate vulnerabilities. So it's a collection. Two key pieces that we landed on ultimately: it's owned, operated, or under the control of an entity. So it could be a government agency that's dictating, it could be a company that's has a group of assets, or it could be a municipality that's managing a group of assets. And the reason that's important is that the work that's being done must be viewed through a consistent risk lens, so that the reason we're running the portfolio is to sort through the assets to create priority. So we have to be looking at the same risk appetites in each piece of the portfolio. So it has to have a consistent set of criteria that you use to assess the whole portfolio. And that typically is not all that easily achieved if you have multiple owners with the multiple objectives. So that was a key piece of definition. We lay out within the document what sorts of portfolios might look like, and we came up with 4 key categories. Single assets all over the place, one location with many assets like municipality, or long linear systems like highways or transmission line systems. And finally, the most complex case is many locations with many assets at each location. So the manual's being designed to handle all of this. We define vulnerability and risk, and I'm not going to go into much detail around these, but these definitions draw from ISO 31000, ISO 14090 series, plus IPCC. And so there was a fair amount of work in going through those various references and generating a set of definitions that was consistent across the board so that we could use it. So vulnerability is a predisposition to be adversely affected, and it includes capacity and ability to cope. So we'll get to that in a minute. And risk is the effect of uncertainty on our objective, and it can be positive or negative. So these are very standard risk definitions. The key part of this whole thing is that we viewed the development of the procedure to be part of an iterative process. And I know we say this all the time, but in this case, we are screening to make decisions about what to do next and some of those actions might mean doing more detailed risk analysis. It might mean doing adaptation planning, but you're going to be digging deeper as you go forward after this. So there is an iterative process where you're coming back to the beginning and asking a similar set of questions, maybe with more detail or maybe more focused on specific set of assets. We needed to define performance response. The protocol has a large section on performance response. In this document, we've provided more information on how to go about actually doing performance response analysis. So what do you need to do? And we drew it from the concept of bow tie analysis. So we look at a climate event, which creates a set of hazards, which we treat as indicators within assessment. That creates impact chains. These yellow bars represent actions that you may be taking in advance of the event to mitigate its impact. So these are preemptive actions. Then we have the event. Then we have response chains leading to outcomes. And ultimately, these are your impacts, your vulnerabilities. And these orange bars represent things that we have in place already to give us additional adaptive capacity to the event. So it could be procedures, it could be other things that you've done to mitigate the impact once it has occurred. So that's a key concept that kind of flows through the entire process. We needed to spend a fair amount of time defining archetype and climate indicator. What is an archetype and why did we choose the word archetype? There was a fair amount of discussion around that. Why didn't we just call it an asset class? The reason ultimately was that we viewed archetypes to represent assets, hard assets, like engineered assets, but also softer things like green infrastructure or populations or the way the company is operating certain things or the organization. So archetype was a broader definition that allowed us to incorporate a lot of that content within the procedure and not create those little glitch moments that people have when they say things like, why are you calling a person an asset? That doesn't seem right. those sorts of things. So it was a way of getting around that. Climate indicators are pretty much the same sort of approach that we've used throughout the PIEVC. So that was an easier activity. But what was clear to us, and this is critical, was that you don't develop one without the other. You need to do these pieces side by side with a lot of interaction back and forth. And so this comes through a number of times in the process as well, that you develop your archetype with an eye on the climate, and you develop your climate with an eye on the archetypes. So that front end piece before you get into the assessment is a really important piece of work. Well, that takes us to methods. Once again, it gives us the procedures, detailed guidance, and worksheets and calculation processes. So this is where it can get really dry because we're basically laying out the calculations. We had a discussion a while back, well, wouldn't it be great if we could do this, say, based in a computer online or within a computer model. And in reflecting on that afterwards, it occurred to me that basically what we've got here are the algorithms that you would use to do that. So that was the intent. Well, okay, I'm going to go through these first three bits pretty quickly. We need to establish a team, and the document gives some guidance on about who should be on the team and those sorts of things. This is consistent across PIEVC, is scope, context, and criteria. So we draw on some of that. A lot of the catalog stuff is reflected in here, stuff that developed out of the PIEVC protocol and out of the high-level screening guides reflected. You need to configure your assessment. So we need to evaluate performance response. We need to construct our archetypes, and we need to construct our hazard indicators. So there's a fair amount of activity, as I said, that iteration back and forth. We provide worksheets for doing this. So this is a performance response worksheet, and you would identify per archetype are what are the key things that we're worried about: the design, its functionality, its purpose, and it gives us a way of doing that in a more rigorously. But the one thing that's new in this is that we made sure that you need to identify your assessment objectives, because these performance response criteria draw from them. So this sets what's important. This sets how each individual asset or archetype group fits within that. You construct your archetypes. This is an example that we developed. So this is pretty fluid, but basically you need to define what attributes are important within the context of your archetype. So what type of asset, what's its purpose, how old is it, where is it located generally? So are we in the north, or are we somewhere in a desert region? We need to understand its required level of service, in this case, the value of the asset. So are we looking at something that's relatively inexpensive, or are we looking at trillion-dollar assets? How many people are affected in this case? Climate sensitivities, the adaptive capacities, and any other considerations. And then we go through the portfolio and say, these particular elements of that portfolio fit under this archetype 1, these fit under archetype 2, these fit under archetype 3. What it allows you to do is, as you go forward and you do your assessment, you can now go back and say, we've identified that archetype 3 is vulnerable, and within archetype 3, we know what the assets are. So we can now start keying in on those particular assets. And there we go. We establish our indicators as well. Once again, we come back to that iteration between the development of archetypes and climate hazards. This little box is consistent throughout the document, where we provide additional guidance. So if there's a little piece of information that might help in the field, it's here. You can then go from there and get into more detailed parts back in principles. We conduct a vulnerability assessment, which is a key part of the work. Vulnerability for each archetype is a function of exposure, its sensitivity and its adaptive capacity. This draws from ISO and from IPCC. So we've developed the equations, and then we get into questions, well, what is vulnerability specifically? How do you measure it? Those sorts of questions. So we've defined a 3-point scale within the context of the large portfolio manual. But there's key guidance saying, look, if you think that 5 is better, use 5. If you think 7 is better, use 7. If you think some scale that you already use is fine, use that. So the reason is that this particular 3-point scaling approach draws from a standard risk analysis technique called Prouty analysis. So it's kind of like high, medium, low kind of analysis. And given the fact that we're looking at our archetypes at a high level, it seemed a reasonable approach to streamlining our assessment of vulnerability while still getting the biggest bang for the buck. So you can use what you want, but the document itself uses this as an example. And so we also define this concept of adaptive deficit. And this is the trickiest part in any vulnerability analysis, because we always say, we're worried about the sensitivity and we're worried about the adaptive capacity. But if you think about it, then going back to high school, we have a number line. On one side, sensitivity is on the negative side of the line and adaptive capacity is on the positive side of the line. And if you want to make a consistent equation, you have to figure out how you're going to balance those two out. So way that most vulnerability analysis that I have used in the past and I've seen documented is you take the negative of adaptive capacity. So you make it consistent all on one side of the line. So you now have one parameter that tells you all of that. So it's a little mathematical trick that makes the math work. And so, and I've seen it consistently through many vulnerability assessment techniques. So we talk about adaptive deficits, inability to adapt. We measure the exposure on the same PIEVC process that we've always done, is a yes-no sort of analysis. We do a sensitivity analysis. The document provides three tiers of analysis for both sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And the one I'm showing here is the intermediate level. So it allows you to make a decision as to how deep do I want to go into sensitivity. Do I want to do a really high level? Do I want to get a bit more information? Do I want to go into exquisite detail on what the sensitivities are? It provides worksheets like this one. And it just sort of looks at the things that we believe are driving the sensitivity in this area. So design, is it a high sensitivity, medium, or low? That sort of thing. And then it creates a numerical factor out of that so that we can use our equations. Adaptive deficit does the same thing from an adaptive deficit perspective. So the procedure provides guidance on how to set these up, and it provides examples of each so that users can now build this into either a worksheet. And I think probably at the end of the day, you'd probably be using database to do this. Calculate your vulnerability based on the equations, and the document provides some guidance on what do you do once you know what your vulnerabilities are. So this is consistent with all PIEVC. We say if it's a high, then it's a candidate for this, candidate for that. This does not make the decision for the practitioner. It says, these are the things that you would typically think about if you were looking at high vulnerability. It offers up an additional optional risk analysis because you may not want to. You may at the time you get the vulnerabilities assigned and say, okay, I don't need to do a high level risk analysis. I want to do detailed, maybe high level screening guide or full portfolio assessment on archetypes in category 3. So you may make that decision and then you would bypass this, or you may send it off to an engineering team to deal with the vulnerabilities, or you may have other approaches that you would take. But we're faced with the questions, even at this point, we still have a situation where you could have a dozen or 2 dozen archetypes that are showing high vulnerability, and you want to do further sort before you get to those decisions. And it uses more traditional risk analysis to do that, and these are all familiar to all of us. Risk is consequence times likelihood. That's the way PIEVC is structured. The only thing is, since we have vulnerability, we're drawing our consequence from the vulnerability scoring, and we are applying a factor as to how significant is that vulnerability in these particular cases. So you could have the example that one of my colleagues uses is that I could have a highly vulnerable handrail, but it's not significant. Whereas I could have a highly vulnerable bridge, and that is significant. So it's a way of getting some clarity on that. And then the rest of this just follows the same sort of pattern that we've always used in our risk assessment work. The manual cites the middle baseline methodology from the high-level screening guides. That's the approach that we are recommending there. But once again, if you want to use a more detailed analysis, it allows for that. You calculate your risk just like we always have, and then once again we have a set of recommendational criteria around what you would do if you were identifying these sorts of risks, high, medium, or low. It does, once again, just like the catalog, give some brief coverage of what do you do next in terms of adaptation planning, risk treatment, those sorts of things. So it provides a brief thumbnail, but it doesn't provide full coverage. So it is, once again, I cite this at the beginning and the end. This is the bookmark. These are the bookends of this, is that it's an iterative process. We do this to find out what we need to do next as part of that iterative process. And I was given 20 minutes and I took 22. So there you go. I'm available for questions and discussion.